Welcome everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. We're very happy to have Mohamed Defaa here to present on the Middle East. This program is sponsored by the New Hampshire Humanities Council. That's why we've got all of these like exit interviews there for you. So just some questions about the presentation and some information about the New Hampshire Humanities Council. They've sponsored many of our best programs here at the library. So if you have any questions about them, feel free to ask me or any of the librarians. We can chat about that. So without further ado, I want to thank Mohamed Defaa for the Middle East.
Good evening. I would just like to try to test my voice to see if you guys can hear me. Is that okay in the back there? Perfect. Two things. The first one is I'm very happy to be here. I'm always happy to work with the Humanities Council to be able to share my background and part of my heritage, but also part of my education. My name is Mohamed, and sometimes people assume that because my name is Mohamed that I'm going to be presenting on the Middle East and Islam and Arabs. I'm the one who gets the keys of all those enigmas over there. I'm like you, I'm educated. I educated myself. I had to reject all my heritage, my religion, and my background and start over. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight here is not the truth. It's just an opinion. And I would appreciate that you respect it. You can take it, you can reject it, you can deny it. Just be nice. The second thing is when people talk about the Middle East, they tend to put a lot of complex things under a very small umbrella. And this program, this little talk, will just help you clarify some of the concepts, which are very complex, as I said, but also will help you see clearly into some contradictions and conflicts. But the most beautiful thing is when you hear someone talking about those kind of things, when you leave this room, you'll be able to say, oh, I've never heard about that. The step that you will make further after tonight and go and read about it and ask about it and question is a sign of how you interacted with me. And that's why I do that. I don't do this to convince people. I don't do this to defend Islam. This religion survived for 15 centuries. It doesn't need me. But I do that to share what I think, how I educated myself, and what I discovered, and what I learned from meetings like tonight. I always get out of meetings like tonight with wonderful questions, sometimes very difficult questions, sometimes very accurate questions, and I do my best to answer them honestly, but also respectfully. So, what am I going to talk about tonight? Okay, so I'm going to try to explain a little bit what is the term Middle East means. It is more a geopolitical term than anything else. So I'll try to explain how we get to put a huge geographical, ethnic, cultural, linguistic area under a one title. I'm going to also talk about Islam and Islamism. A lot of confusion between what is Islam and what is Islamism. I'm going to also touch to the religion and politics in that part of the world. And I'm going to talk about something that is really confusing for a lot of non-Arabs, what we call Arabism, or Pan-Arabism. I'm going to also touch to the phenomenon of the Islamic State that is scaring everyone, including me. And then I'm going to show you what I call voices of tolerance. One of the questions that I've got lately is that why there are no Muslims and Arabs who are raising their voices to denounce what's going on. And my answer was, it's not that there are no voices, there are no ears. To raise your voice, you have to have an ear that is listening to you. Unfortunately, the media is not playing a role that is conducting the message from the person who speaks to the person who listens. And I will give you some names that you can go and explore to see how things are seen from the other perspective, from the other side. So, let's talk about the term Middle East. I have two kind of videos here that I got on a website called Maps of War, mapsofwar.com, and they absolutely summarize the complexity, the historical complexity, and the geopolitical complexity of that region. When we will watch them, I'm 100% sure that you're gonna be so surprised as I was the first time I saw them, and then we can continue talking. I'll start with history and religion. I'm not going to comment on them. In one of the presentations, a lady saw the green color and how it was expended, and she said, in the middle of this show, she said, look at the green color. A few seconds after she saw the blue color, and she said, I take back what I said. So this little video here shows you how complicated this region is, and how civilizations and religions came and not only overlapped but also interfered, and I would say conflicted with the others too. So why not? So some of them lived together, but most of the time it was a conflictual relationship between a lot of religions. The other one that I would like to show you is the imperial history. So, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you see that?
Lots of conquests from one little area.
Well,
And influence as a result of that conquest.
exactly. And also, I always think that it is very simplistic to ask the question, why it is so complicated over there when you look at this? Because it is very complex, and the complexity is not only in the current event that we're seeing right now. The complexity is in the historical and also the cultural, and it's also at the level of identities. You know, the conflict that we see in the Middle East today is not only a conflict of interest, it's also a conflict of cultures and identities. And this term, the Middle East, which is sometimes could be a stereotype. There's a comedian who's an American of Arab descent. His name is Dean Ubaidallah, and he said that he was in an airplane, and a lady asked him, "Where are you from?" And he goes, I'm Palestinian. And she said, "Do you like couscous?" And he goes, "No, couscous is Moroccan." And she said, "Well, it's Middle Eastern anyway." So the confusion putting a lot of people under this umbrella, under the same umbrella, that's where all the stereotypes start, that where it's all the judgment stuff, and only education can help. So, and where is this term Middle East coming from? It's coming from a journalist whose name is Alfred Mahan, and Alfred wrote an article in 1902, and he tried to describe the region. He couldn't find a common name to put on it, so he called it the Middle East. And the funny thing is that the people who are in the Middle East, they describe themselves compared to someone in Iran as the Middle West, because they're the Western Iran. So it's just a matter of geographical position. The funny thing is that after that, this name became a definition of a world region, and the British government, when the British government wanted to assign someone to manage this in terms of influence and budgeting and military actions, they nominated Winston Churchill as the first director, and they gave him the keys of the Office Middle Eastern Affairs. Right now in the United States, the Middle East, within this Middle East department, if I could call it, Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan are also included because of a budget matter. So think about it, if I'm from Morocco and I think that the Middle East is part of my culture, a guy from Afghanistan should be my cousin. Except that we don't talk the same language, we don't eat the same food, we don't dress the same way, we don't have the same relationship to our wives. Everything is different. So, and when you think about it, from different perspectives, look at it from the perspective of languages. There are so many languages, and most of the time when you talk about the Middle East, the first reference that comes to the mind is Arabs. Why? Look how many people and how many languages, look how many countries, look how many religions. So the point I'm trying to make here is that one of the things, the first thing that we should question in our way to look at that part of the world is that title. Yes?
They forgot the Yazidi.
The Yazidis. Yes. Yes. I forgot a lot of this. And one of the things also that makes this region very complicated is that when you saw the colors of the empires that came one after another that occupied or ruled this part of the world, the notion of borders did not exist. And it existed after the European colonialism, and some of the countries were created as recently as my kid was born. 71. You know, Qatar, for example, was born in 1971, and it's actually a very recent created identity with political orientations, with geopolitical strategical intentions and objectives. And I asked, I'm a teacher, and I asked so many of my students, when I say the Middle East, what is the first word that comes to your mind? And 9 out of 10 said, Islam. And it became part of my work to educate and say, well, first, Islam is not the main component of the Middle East. There are non-Muslims in the Middle East. And what is Islam? So, when I think about it, Islam, as I inherited it from my parents in Morocco when I was a kid, I never went to school to learn about it until I was in middle school, or I didn't choose it. My father took me with him to the mosque. I never said no because it was part of my. But when I grew up and I started asking questions, I started discovering things that I did not know, and that my father never taught me because he never knew them. Islam is very important to understand at what level we're going to talk about Islam. Are we going to talk about Islam as a faith or as a religion? Faith is an individual thing. You know, when you have a faith in God, some people have faith in football, some people have faith in their wives, and some people have faith in Satan, you know. But a religion is a set of rules that came after that faith. You have to embrace that faith, and then take the religion as a set of rules. Some of the people saying that they are man-made, some of the people that they're saying they're inspired to some prophet to help human beings to manage their faith. So, Islam came, Mohammed brought Islam because he was the prophet of Islam, and Islam came as a set of rules to manage the faith of Muslims. So, are we going to talk about Islamic or Islamology? Because Islam has a culture too. The Islamic culture in Iran is completely different than the Islamic culture in Morocco. Completely. We celebrate, I'll tell you a kind of a funny story. There was a big battle between the Sunnis and the Shia. And the Sunnis won the battle. The Shia lost the battle. And the Shia celebrate a holiday called Ashura to mourn one of the sons of the Prophet, the grandsons of the Prophet, who died in that battle. The Sunnis celebrate that same holiday to celebrate the victory. And my mother is a Sunni, so she met the Shia guy in a store, and she said, "Happy Ashura." The guy was so mad at her because my mother did not know. She was not educated. No one told her that that holiday is seen from two different perspectives. So Islam, what I try to tell you here is that Islam is a culture. Even within that big umbrella of the religion, the cultures change. And the Muslim Chinese, they have a whole different way of celebrating the holidays than the Muslims, the Berber Muslims in the mountains of Algeria. And they don't do it the same language, using the same language. Of course, I'm not talking about the religion. They pray at the same time, they pray the same way, but the culture is different. But let's not forget the Islam as an ideology. And that is what is making the media right now. If you look at the name of Iran, it's called the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why is that? It's because Iran want to tell you we are using Islam not only as a religion but also as a way of managing politics, which is different from Tunisia. Okay? Tunisia have a constitution that is based on a French constitution, and they have part of it is Islamic, but it's not ideologically Islamic. It's secular. So those are things that we have to pay attention to when we're talking about Islam. Even the language, when you use English, for example, you have Islam, which is the equivalent of Judaism and Christianity. You have the Quran, which is the equivalent of the Torah and the Bible. Muslim, as we talk about a Jew or Jewish or Christian. We have Islamic, like Judaic and Christian. Those are adjectives. But there is no such a thing as Islamism in the political sense. There's no such a thing as Christianism in the political sense. And I will explain to you why. We don't say this guy is Judaist, like we describe someone as an Islamist. Bin Laden was an Islamist. Okay? And Zarqawi was an Islamist. It's different. You can describe someone who's studying Judaism as a Judaist. You can say Judaist researcher. But when you say Islamist, we do not talk about someone who's doing research, scientific research. It's an Islamologist who's doing the research. So this word, those two concepts are charged politically. And the concept of Islam, as we know it, because so many people are using those terms that are coming from a different culture, different language, different background, and they're using them in the media to defend some political opinions while they really don't know what they mean. When you think about Islam as a theological concept, God, which is Allah, and Allah is the literal translation of God in English. Now in the media, it's a word that scares people. If you say Allahu Akbar, people will get going from a Catholic. This concept is based on the concept of Allah. Allah inspired Mohamed, who was a prophet, a Quran, which is the book, the holy book for Muslims, like the Bible, and the Quran, as it is meant in Arabic, is described in Arabic, is what was read. Qara'a in Arabic is to read. So what was read to Muhammad, what was inspired, revealed to him as a word of God. That's why a lot of people have a confusion between the word that was revealed and the book that contains the word. The book that contains the word is called al-Mushaf. And Al-Quran is the content of that book. So it is so important, the revelation that the Muslims have is not to the book as a piece of paper. They respect it a lot. And from a culture to another one, it's a veneer. It's kind of subjected to a certain level of divinity. But all the combination here, historically, what Muhammad could not find in the Quran because the things were changing in the society, the people from the religion completed with a Sharia. A Sharia means literally the path. It's the path to follow to be a good Muslim. And Shara is the rules or the way to follow that path. So a lot of people are scared of this word. They say, oh, there are some Muslims who are coming to the United States to force the Sharia on us. But the Sharia, in fact, is a set of rules that are made up by some people, some scholars, to help Muslims live a life within the boundaries of Islam. I'm not saying that some people are not using it for political interest. They are. I was talking about ideology. What is ideology? Ideology is when you use a set of concepts, especially the religious concepts, because they have a sacred value. They are what we call an argument of authority. When you use those to manage life financially, morally, politically, it becomes an ideology. So that's what the Sharia in some country is used for political. There are some leaders who use the Sharia to protect themselves and justify what they're doing. Bad things or good things, they justify it through the Sharia. But how come a lot of people are talking about the fact that Islam is not compatible to democracy, for example, or it's not compatible to politics? One of the things that I read by a philosopher that just passed away, he's an Algerian who taught all his life in the Sorbonne in France. His name is Mohamed. He did a comparison between Jesus and Mohammed. And his idea was, when Jesus came with his message as a new way of life, he came in a society that was very well structured. The Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had its laws, its schools, its military, its financial strategies, its interests in the world. So Jesus came in a very stable political system. When Muhammad came with his message, he came in a total anarchy, in a tribal society that had no government, no schools, no military. The tribes were fighting among each other. And he had to establish himself not as a leader of a new religion, but also as a legislator, as a political leader, as an economical advisor, as a faith manager. And Muhammad, those are just the different way that people would call him, was a diplomat, a head of state, a military leader, a chief legislator. A lot of people are saying that Muhammad was a bloody guy because he convinced some people by the sword to embrace his religion. History showed that, yes, Islam in some parts of the world convinced the people by the sword. That's true. But the intention behind that initiation of a fight is meant to be to protect that religion. And what is funny is that there are two things that happen in history, and the books in the West do not talk about it at all. Two events that were, I would say, significantly important in the life of Islam as a religion. The first event is that Muhammad came within his family in the city of Mecca, in Saudi Arabia now, and he said, "Hey guys, I'm your cousin, and I have a new message. There's only one God, and you have to embrace it. You have to throw away all your statues and the things that the pagan things that you worship." And the first reaction of his family, who was managing that city, was like, "Are you kidding? You are threatening our socio-economical status in the city." And what they did, after a few years, I think in 2 or 3 years, they tried to kill him. So he fled with his followers, with his, actually, 60 of his followers. He went by himself with very few followers, 5 or 6. He was welcomed, protected, and invited by 2 Jewish tribes. One is called al-Aus and one is called al-Khazraj. They were fighting all the time between them, and they had a lot of economical conflicts, financial conflicts. So they went to him and they said, listen, if you can find a common ground between us and get us to have a peace, we'll protect you. That's what he did. They protected him. They became his followers. They became, and the first big people that were already organized as cities, two cities, Al-Aws and Khazraj, was Jewish. Now, another part of those people who fled, the 60 people, fled and they were followed by the army of the family from Mecca, the pagans. And they went to a Christian king in what we call today Somalia. And they proved to him by reciting the Quran that the Quran has a lot of similarities with the Bible. And that if you're a Muslim and you do not testify and justify that Jesus is a prophet, that Moses is a prophet, that Abraham is a prophet, you're not a Muslim. One of the conditions is that you have to admit that all of those guys are prophets of God, monotheistic prophets. You cannot be a Muslim. Your faith as a Muslim is not complete. So that king hosted them, welcomed them, and protected them against the people who were coming to kill them. And they were his partners economically. They had a lot of shared economical interests. So he defied the economical interests. What I'm trying to say here is that the early interaction between Islam and the other religions were at some point very peaceful. Islam was the baby of the monotheistic religions. And then some people protected it because they saw on it a positive message. Now, do we see that positive message now? Some people tell me, yeah, but why we don't see that? Well, because at that time, there were probably 600, 700 Muslims on the face of earth. Today, there are 1.5 billion Muslims. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, like the Christians, like the Jews, like the atheists, like they're just human beings. And of course, it's always the mean human beings that make waves. It's always the people who are trying to hurt the others that we see on the news. I've never seen on CNN someone buying flowers for his wife. I've always seen someone killing another, or someone saying bad things about the other. So that's a very important thing. So, but very early in the history of Islam, and this is a fact, this is a historical fact, very early in the history of Islam, politics interfered, the interest, the thirst for power kind of won against the faith. And the people that I put here are what we call the holy successors of Mohammed. Those are the people who followed him very early. And Abu Bakr was one of the first people who embraced Islam, and he replaced Muhammad. Muhammad died, and he ruled the little Islamic empire at that time for 2 years. Then Umar, who was one of the prominent leaders in the early Islam, and he basically, I would say, conditioned the growth of the Islamic empire. He was killed. Uthman is the guy who followed him. He was also killed. And Ali was the first follower of Muhammad. He was the first person who embraced Muhammad's message. He was his cousin, and he was the husband of his daughter. He was also killed. So that tells you that very early in the history of Islam, political assassination became a way of defending political interests. And something that conditioned the life of Muslims and created a separation in the politics of Islam as early as 661. So I would say a little less than 30 years after the death of Muhammad, the empire or the Muslim community was divided. And I will explain to you how it was divided. It was divided basically to 4 big sections. the sections of the Sunnis, and you hear those words a lot in the news. The Sunnis are coming from the word sunnah, which means the tradition. And where this concept is coming from, when Muhammad died, people get together in a house and said, who is going to rule after him? Some of the people said, okay, we are a tribal community. We have to rule by tradition. We have, it's the tribal society in that time, the Arab tribal society, was electing their leader based on consensus, political consensus. So all the head of the tribes will say, okay, this is our leader. The Khariji, the Shia, which means exactly the party, the political party, or the supporters, they were the people who said, no. We're not going to elect a person. We're going to give the power to the person who is related to Muhammad by blood, because he's going to be a holy person. And then, it's the Sunnis who won because they were a majority. And Ali, as you saw, was the last successor of that line. He came 30 years almost after Muhammad. And when he was killed, those Shia they separated from the Sunnis, and Ali in fact was killed by the Khariji. And the Khariji, it's called the neutrals, the translation, but they're not neutral politically. They're neutral from the deal that the two people made, the Sunnis and the Shia. So what happened is the Khariji were so mad, they embraced violence and they embraced political assassination for anyone who is not following the path of Muhammad, say radically. The Sufis are a group of people who were embracing an Islam that was focused more on the spirituality. So a Sufi, there's some kind of confusion about where this word is coming from. There are Sufis in the Greek philosophy. There are also the Sufis as we know them in the Arabs, because in the Arab culture, because the word Suf is coming from the wool, and they used to be shepherds, so they used to dress up with the wool. That they were very remotely located. They left the political life and they lived a spiritual life way out of the civilization of the people who were politically fighting. And those are the big section, huh? Like as we know the Sunnis today, there are so many divisions among the Sunnis. There are the Malikites, there are the Hanbalites, there are so many schools, and I found this explanation of how the Sunnis are divided and how the Shi'is are divided, because the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the Shi'is in the news is that, okay, this is a solid group, they're homogeneous, they all think the same, they all respect the same culture, it's exactly the opposite. So, even the Sufis are now divided, because very early after the European colonialism left the Islamic world, so many political regimes used the Sufis as a way of orienting the population politically, because the Sufis were very well respected, so they made them kind of an instrument to manipulate people politically. So they became so divided too. And then I was talking about when the European colonialism. Sorry, I put an Arabic accent to give some authenticity to my presentation.
You're doing well.
Thank you. If you want, I can take out the accent. So I talked about the European colonialism, and you see that the European colonialism did something significantly influential in that region. What they did, they cut some countries or some regions based on the interest of those countries who were occupying France, Italy, England, Portugal, Spain. So, what happened here? Geographically speaking, when a tribe existed for centuries, and suddenly this tribe is divided by a border, and part of it becomes in Iraq, and part of it becomes in Syria, as we know today, and another part becomes in Jordan. The spirit of the tribe is not divided. They still consider themselves from the tribe. It's only the nationalistic or the nationalist identity that is changing. So people are going to become Iraqis, but they're going to still be Ibn Salman. So there are the Ibn Salman from Iraq, and there are the Ibn Salman from Syria, and there are the Ibn Salman from Jordan. What happened here? If you hit the Ibn Salman in Syria, the Ibn Salman in Jordan are not happy, and the Ibn Salman in Iraq are not happy. So that sense of tribalism, if I could say that, is still vibrating. Now, to kill that sense, the strategy from certain countries is how to encourage the nationalistic part of the identity. How to tell people, hey, you're not Venezuelan, you're not Arabs, you're Iraqis first. You have to defend the Iraqi interests, because Iraq is an ally of the United States, Syria is an ally of Russia. And then this inflamed a feeling that was created right after the independence of certain countries like Egypt and Iraq, and that movement became what we call the Pan-Arabism. The leader of the Pan-Arabism at that time was Jamal Abdel Nasser. And Jamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, was the leader, and he was so charismatic that he created a wave of solidarity among the Arabs in the world. He basically nationalized the canal, and he get in a war against Israel. He created such a charisma that most of the Arabs forgot about their tribal differences, and they said, okay, we're Arabs. And then we're Arabs because we hate Israel, and we're sick of being occupied by the Ottoman Empire and by the British and by the French. Our Arabism is what's going to put us back on the surface. It's going to bring back our glory. Well, after the war of 6 days, when they lost against Israel, they call it the Nakba al-Kubra, the biggest catastrophe, if I can translate it this way. They were disappointed. So among them, a group of people was born. And one thing that I would like to add about the Pan-Arabism is that it was strictly secular movement. It did not believe in religion as a vehicle of success. That's because most of his leaders, some of them were Christian, some of them were Orthodox Christian from Iraq, some of them were atheists, some of them were Sunnis, some of them were Shiite. So they did not care about the religion. They put their religious identity aside, and they get together and they built a project based on their political agenda. What happened is that this, after the defeat, it became like a utopia. And the discovery of oil showed the world that this part is so rich that the interest goes beyond the borders of this part of the Middle East. So we found ourselves, here's a region that we knew for centuries as desert. A region that had no interest. And suddenly this region became the heart of the economical and energy in the world. And of course, at that time, the West was just kind of recovering from the Second World War. The reconstruction was at the high, energy was so needed, and then the interest became so aggressive, so there's actually a very important documentary made by Al Jazeera English. It's called The Secret of the Seven Sisters. The Secret of the Seven Sisters. The Seven Sisters are the 7 oil companies, Shell and Total, and this documentary is wonderful. It shows you how very early in the 20s, those people came together and they decided to draw the borders of what we call the Middle East right now. And the guy who did actually draw the map of some countries that we know now as Lebanon or Jordan or Iraq is a Greek engineer who was very knowledgeable of the reserves existing in the area, and he decided to draw the borders the way that he will respect the interests of the United States, England, France, Spain, and avoid conflicts between those countries in the region. It is a wonderful documentary. The problem is that when the pan-Arabism was defeated and looked like a utopia, a group of people stood up and said, hey, listen, when were we ruling the world? We were ruling the world when we believed that Islam is the best thing. Let's go back to Islam. Let's go back to our ancestors, Salaf. A Salaf in Arabic is the ancestor. And that's where the word Salafism, which is the most proactive Islamist current in the Islamic world, it's very aggressive, very rigid, very radical in its interpretation of Islam, and it's dealing with general affairs in general, like women's rights, non-Muslims. It's called Salafism. And the Muslims now became a subject or a target themselves of this group, who is a radical group that was born under the name of the Brother Muslims in Egypt. It was first designed by a guy called Hassan alBanna, and this guy was executed by Jamal Abdel Nasser, and Sayyid Qutb was the philosopher who built the doctrine of this movement. He is still very well followed by the people from Al-Qaeda and the people from Al-Nusra. I don't think he's followed by the people from the Islamic State, because the Islamic State is a total monster, I would say ideologically speaking. It's against Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra, and because it came with so many different views. Those two guys was both executed by Jamal Abdel Nasser because he saw on them the threat. But the movement still evolved to the point that its first assassination was the assassination of Anwar Sadat in '81, after he signed the Camp David treaty with Israel, recognizing it and visiting Jerusalem. So what happened here? What happened is that a group of people who have a political agenda, who were disappointed by what the Arabs tried to bring as a social, political, and economical project, decided to bring another project as an alternative, and that project is founded on the religion. Not the religion as a way of living the spirituality, but religion as a way of managing politics. Not only they embraced religion as a way of managing politics, but they embraced the radical way. And why they did that? It's because they were on the edge of the political power. You see, they were not allowed to be a political party. So of course, they were hiding and they were trying to fight to prove their existence and to carry their message to the people. And who are the people who are going to embrace this? The people who are going to embrace this are the people who were disappointed, the people who were poor, the people who were deprived, the people who were put in a position that did not allow them to go up in the social scale. And it was their way to prove to themselves that they are valuable. And that's why when you look at the countries today who embraced, who said, okay, you're an Islamist, come, here's the government. Like in Morocco, the Moroccan government is an Islamist government. In Tunisia, the Islamist government ruled for like 6 or 7 years after the revolution. And they said, okay, we're giving up. Those movements that are now in the center of the political process are not aggressive. They're not killing anyone. They're people who are trying, who are in the parliament, who are trying to prove that they could manage, they could rule. But the people who are on the side of the societies, outside of the circles, are the people who are very aggressive. And one of the things that this created is a very confusing situation in the Arab world. We ended up having 3 different categories of conflicts. I'm sorry to say categories, but you know, I don't know how to call them the categories. We ended up having a sheikh, a salaf, the person who is convinced that the best way to live with dignity and respect and to live a decent life is to go back to our ancestors. Because when our ancestors embraced the weird Islam, as they call it in their jargon, they were successful, they ruled the world. We ended up having people like me who were westernized. You know, they said, okay, this is the time to embrace democracy and try to open up and embrace other cultures. And we had a generation of, after September 11 in the Arab world, and the Muslim world, that was completely confused. Who am I gonna follow? Am I gonna follow my ancestor or my youngest brother who dresses like an American, who drinks alcohol and goes to parties, or my brother or my father who goes to the mosque and does not drink alcohol, does not go to parties? Who is right? And this generation was completely lost. And of course, with the recession, with all the media, with all the conflict in the ideologies, this generation found itself completely lost, with no alternative, less educated, victims of ideology, lost in the Arab Spring. They fought for their rights, but they found themselves in the middle of, against war machines. We lost so much lives, and then they were disappointed by their leaders. If you think about each leader in the modern history of the Arab world, you will find out that it's a dictator. It's someone who is respected the interests of the West and his family, becoming a billionaire and killing his own people. Think about Bashar al-Assad, Saddam. Think about Ben Ali in Tunis, in Tunisia. Think about Hassan II in Morocco. He was my cousin, but I'm just kidding. I wouldn't be here. I'd be driving a Rolls Royce. Okay, so this is the generation who is a victim to those kind of ideologies, completely lost. And when you think about a kid who goes and pushes a button and kills himself and kills 60 people, 100 people, what kind of human being is that? It's a human being that lost hope completely, that lost dignity, and didn't have any other choice. I'm not excusing them, I'm sorry. I don't want you to understand that. What I'm trying to explain to you, that those people who are criminals in front of the law are also people who are victims of so many other phenomena and factors, and they are as vast as we are trying to understand why they're doing that. I found a document, I'm going to skip this because that shows the differences between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and it tells you a lot about how those groups try to indoctrinate those young people, how they try to give them, I would say, a motivation that make them think that what they are not getting here in life, they are getting it out there. That they are destined to heaven, and they will be having 67 virgins or whatever, and that there's rivers of wine, and they deserve it. So, and in order to do that, they have to kill the infidels. And the big numbers of infidels they kill is in Iraq, in Syria, in Morocco, in Lebanon. So, when you think about terrorism, we are the first people suffering of it. You know, terrorism doesn't have nationality. It targets all the people who are willing to be afraid and side against another people. It has an agenda. So, they all describe like obligation to jihad. The last thing I'm gonna explain before I show you the names of the what I call the voices of tolerance is this concept of jihad that is completely confusing people. And jihad became a political word called jihadism right now. And when you think about it, the word jihad in Arabic as a language means the effort that you're making to accomplish something. We fast Ramadan, and our jihad during the day is to go through the day without drinking, without eating, without having sex, without talking bad about people, without doing something that would harm someone, and do something good in life that you will be happy and you'll make your creator happy. This is a jihad. You know? But when you hear someone saying, I am part of this group and I am a jihadi, that's a different way of using this word. So it's completely different. I would like to show you some people that you could read or explore. The first one I will show, before I do that, I would like to show you, I'm sorry, I forgot that, that terrorism and that jihadism, as we call it now, targets people within the Islamic society that are very active intellectually and the people who are trying to educate. The university professor, Razul Karim Sadiq, he's from Pakistan. He was assassinated. Sheikh Hassan was an Algerian singer. He was assassinated with several bullets in the head. Samir Qasir is a Lebanese journalist and author. He was killed with a car bomb, and he's one of the most proactive and wonderful authors, very prominent intellectuals. So those people target intellectuals inside their own society first. Abu Hamid is a Tunisian. He lived in France. He wrote a beautiful book called The Malady of Islam. A great read that shows you that Islam came as a great intention, and the way that people used it, the way that the media portrayed, some people are scared of it. But any person who is scared of something without educating themselves about it is the definition of ignorance. That's the proper definition of ignorance. As human beings, we fear everything we ignore, everything we don't know, even the dark when we are kids. So we imagine that all the negative and bad things are in the things that we cannot see, the things that we cannot smell, and the things that we cannot understand. So which means that education is the best way to fight ignorance. Muhammad Arkunis wrote so many books about Islam, and this is the most beautiful one. It's called Rethinking Islam. Fatima Mernissi is a Moroccan sociologist and a philosopher. She wrote a lot about the women's rights in the Arab and Islamic world. She was one of the first ladies who was like a very strong voice, started in the 60s, and was not allowed to go to so many Arab countries because of her opinions, because of her. Tahir bin Jaloun is a novelist. He wrote very early in the 70s about the conditions of young Muslim women in some countries. Abdurrahman Mourif is a Sudanese author, novelist. He did a lot of years in jail because of his novels. It's a series of 3 novels called Cities of Salt. And he talks about the political assassinations and the way that intellectuals were politically persecuted in some Arab countries like Sudan and Egypt. And Mohamed Shukri is a Moroccan author. He's an author in that, and he also denounced a lot of injustice. Najib Mahfouz is one of the biggest, he's a Nobel, I think a Nobel Prize, the first Nobel Prize, the first Arab Nobel Prize in the history of the Nobel award. And he of course, there was an assassination attempt against him in Egypt. His novels are just like a wonderful source of knowledge of the Arab-Islamic spirit, and I would end up with Tariq Ramadan, who is an Egyptian. He is kind of a controversial a little bit sometimes. He's a very wonderful speaker, but not all the Western intellectuals agree with his views. But it's worth to listen to him. His last book that I didn't put on here, but I could send you a list of those books, and you could, people who are interested could have it. He wrote it with a French philosopher, an atheist philosopher called Edgar Morin, and they both of them, all the book is a conversation between the two of them. This guy is a very religious guy. He's part of the Brother Muslims, and Edgar Morin is an atheist, but they have the most wonderful and respectful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can spend,
answer a few questions.
We can spend a couple minutes on questions. If you have to go, then by all means feel free. If you would please drop off your interviews here at the desk with me as you go, that would be great.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you.
So if there are any questions.
Yes.
With all this division, I think religion is really detrimental to society. This is a perfect example. To have all these divided groups. How do you expect to ever reach a plateau or an equilibrium that will finally bring the Islamic people together? And I mean, I'm sure this is the question is asked by everyone that's in power now. But as a Arab, what do you think? What do you think?
Well, I think you mentioned a very important word in your question. The division is among the people who are having a political agenda, who are running behind power, who are trying to control. But if you go to the Arab Islamic society, people are living in peace in most of it. You know, Indonesia is the biggest Islamic country and a very peaceful country. I mean, there are some issues in some part of it, but the people in the street are not really into those kind of fights. They're victims of those fights.
I understand that. but it's like, let's take the Protestant faith as an example.
Mhm.
You had Christianity, you had Catholic, and then you had the king that didn't wanted a divorce, so they got Protestant. Then you had Mohamed that
Yeah.
decided he wanted different ideas. And in Islam, the same thing is happening. However, the average person is being impacted by the ones that are in power and the ones that are trying to dictate a new form or different form of Islam.
Okay. Well, I'm going to answer this question by a question. How long it took the Christianity to stabilize and settle?
By the Roman Empire.
I mean,
Yeah.
I know, in a peaceful way. A few years ago, there was the fights between the Protestants and in Ireland. So, the Arab and the Islamic world is a fairly new word to know, to autonomy, to political autonomy. Starting the 13th century, the Arab-Islamic civilization collapsed. And the power was between the hands of people who had no interest in the well-being of the people under them. Corruption became so prominent. Crimes became so prominent. Then with colonialism, after colonialism, the Europeans were not as nice as the history talked about them. Yeah, and we still, countries were getting their independence in 1971. So what does this mean? That means that those countries who are now politically liberated are not necessarily, because what we know in the Arab-Islamic world is something that we call neo-colonialism. And what is the neo-colonialism? The neo-colonialism, let me talk to you about Morocco, for example. The French people came to Morocco in 1912, and they left in 1956. From 1912 to 1956, they chose a class of people and they educated the descendants of this class. They sent their kids to France to be educated. Those kids came back, became the leaders when the French people left. But what those kids did, they respected the interest of French. So French never left. We still speak French. I'm a French teacher. I never chose to teach French. I never chose to speak French. I had to go to French school since I was 4 or 5 years old. So that's the neo-colonialism. What we see today is the result of decades, centuries of mistreatment and humiliation and corruption. It's going to take a long time, because the people who are victims of all those fights are people who are not making decisions, politically speaking. They're not educated, they're not strong, they're not rich. So they're basically living this horror. It's going to take generations in those countries. Tunisia is an excellent example. It's a small country. The level of education is much higher than Morocco, for example, or the population is small. Tunisians are like 7 million or 8 million. And now the Tunisians are like so proactive. Just last week, they voted a law that does not exist in any Islamic country. Very progressive law. So it's going to happen. What happened in 2011 with what we call the Arab Spring is an excellent example of how people get sick of leaders and regimes that are completely corrupted. Look at Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi in Libya was extremely wealthy. He was a dictator. He was financing politicians in France. He was the one who financed the president of France, Sarkozy, to get the election as a president. And why? It's because all his interests were outside, not in his country. Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak to something about the House of Saud, Wahhabism, and the influence and relationship of the Saud family with the British and the Americans
Yes.
and Aramco.
Yeah. That is a very difficult question. But it is an extremely interesting question, and I'll tell you why. It's because what you see today is a result of political action that the British made right after 45. The British people, the British colonialism, did some things that conditioned the state of the Middle East today, the state of the world today. I'll give you two examples. They helped the Zionism to build what we call the state of Israel today. The Convention of Belfort was the Minister of Foreign Affairs to allow the Jews to immigrate from Europe to Israel. That's the first action. The second action is to help them in their war against the Ottomans. They allied with a king, a very prominent person called Sharif Makkah in Saudi Arabia. And Sharif Makkah was a leader of a huge tribe. And when he won the war with them against the Ottomans, they kicked him out, and they took the Al Saud family, who was another family, and they made a deal with them to put them at the head of all the tribes and for a mutual interest. Roosevelt, who was at the time dealing with some issues in Iran, and he was traveling to the region, stopped next to the Saudi waters, and he invited the King of Saudi Arabia to his boat, and he made the best deal with him, overthrowing the British from exploiting the Saudi oil, and the Americans took control over the Saudi oil. So what the British did, they tried to again remotely get the Saudis in trouble by creating some kind of movement within Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis, you heard the word Wahhabis, the Saudis as a tribe were very, and they are still extremely strict about their observance of Islam from the perspective of the school of the Sharia. They belong to I would say a sect, if I could say that, a section, I don't know how to say that, that is called, that is built or designed by guys whose name is Mohamed Wahab was a religious scholar that was very known by his rigor and his extreme radicalism in the interpretation of the rules of Islam. And they basically embraced his rules, his way of looking at life, and his way of interpreting any kind of social, political, economical, and they pushed it. They pushed it all over the world. They financed the schools in Afghanistan, they financed the school in Pakistan, they financed school all over the world to promote that kind of observance of Islam. And that created a faction within the Muslims that is very well influenced by that way of looking at life and interpreting the books, and also because of the encounter of local cultures, and also because of the ignorance of the rules and the books of Islam, and the language, which is Arabic, that is the key of the understanding of Islam. We have seen the creation of Taliban, for example, in Afghanistan. Taliban, the word Taliban is an Urdu word that means the people who are studying Quran. And the Taliban were a faction that was not, they were not fighters. They were not fighters. The fighters against the Soviet Union or against the Russians were called the Mujahideen. But at some point, the Taliban, under the leadership of some people coming from the East, became so active politically speaking, so active in terms as a resistance, and of course, financed, trained, equipped by the United States, the CIA. And when they liberated Afghanistan, of course, they turned against the United States. So, Aramco is the company that manages the oil in Saudi Arabia, and it's actually it's being privatized because with the price of the oil going down as a strategy to encounter Iran and bring Iran down, it's getting now in big financial trouble. So I mean, when I say financial trouble, it's like those people are worth billions and billions and billions of dollars, but they're like, yes.
No, I had two questions, if I may. The first one relates directly to that. With the West, US, Europe, and the East, China, and the India countries, all rapidly moving in a direction which obviates the need for any Middle East oil, such that the value will go to near zero. One wonders why a world policy for this argument within that community would be simply a pox on all your houses, go away. And what prevents that from happening? The second question is perhaps a little bit finer. One of the things that's always bugged me as a Yankee and someone who is conservative of things in general, that we find certain tribes within the world destroying antiquity. I'll never forget the Taliban blowing up those wonderful statues, the rape of all of the museums, and more recently in our own country, the tearing down of Confederate statues, for instance, all of which to me are historical value. And most recently, the absolutely obscene pictures of live beheadings on the internet, which seems to have stopped momentarily. Do you have any comments on either of those areas? The first is very general and sort of philosophical, political, and the second is what's going on?
I'm going to answer your second question as a priority, but this is going to be the last question I'm going to take, if you don't mind. We can stay here until the morning, but my wife is looking at me from the and saying we have to go to eat. You know, I don't see, I think I don't want to speak too much to how some monuments here in the US are being taken.
Right.
This is an American issue. I'm an American, but I have my own opinion about that. I think it's different from how the Taliban are destroying monuments because of their religious approach to that. They say that anything that is portraying a human being or anything that is made by a human being to compete with the divine power to create us as a complex being is not allowed by religion. So destroy any kind of art, and this phenomenon, we knew it since Islam started. Painting was forbidden, sculpture was forbidden, and that's why the Arabic calligraphy, the Muslim calligraphy became such a prominent art, because the artists cheated a little bit and made beautiful pictures of lions and other animals with the Quran written. So no one could tell them, oh, why you're doing this, because it's still the Quran. I mean, the way that it's going on right now in the United States, tearing down some monuments, has a historical meaning that pertains to the history of this country and how this country is dealing with a part that is still hurtful to the American people, which is slavery. And the difference in opinions here is completely different from the approach of the Middle East. When it comes to the beheading, what is the most important thing to a terrorist?
Publicity.
That's why we call him terrorist. Because his objective is to terrorize. And what is the best way to terrorize people? Images. Because they're scared. They go to our brain, they go to our psychology, to our kids. We fear them because of how they can manipulate the images. And what is the most atrocious thing that a human being can do to the other to scare him is to behead someone else in front of him. What if you see some videos about what ISIS are doing to some people in Iraq who are Muslims, Iraqis, Sunnis, because ISIS hate the Shiites. It's so atrocious that you will lose the notion of those people are against Christians or Jews. They're against human beings. As far as you're not doing what they want, you're not believing what they believe, you're not following the path they want you to go, you're a dead person. Thank you very much.